They told me on my very first day the rules that governed this silent, airless sanctum. Catalogue, guard, preserve. Simple, clear, unambiguous. But etched deeper than any Latin inscription, colder than the stone itself, was the final, unspoken commandment delivered with a look that promised eternal damnation. Never, under any circumstance, read them. That should have been enough. I tell myself this now, as the echoes of forgotten blasphemies still claw at the edges of my perception. But back then, it was merely another stricture, a boundary I, in my naive academic fervor, believed I could navigate without truly transgressing. Yet, the very dust of those forbidden shelves, a fine, ancient powder, seemed to cling to me, whispering in languages no priest ever taught, a soft, seductive murmur against the rigid order of my duties. My charge was the Arcanum Inquisitorum, a sub-archive buried deeper than the apostolic library itself, a place where light dared not intrude and silence reigned, broken only by the scratch of my pen on inventory parchment or the faint, almost imperceptible creak of ancient wood. The air here was thick, heavy with the scent of dried parchment, iron, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old blood, or perhaps simply the exhalation of centuries of trapped despair. My initial task was simple enough. Verify the bindings, check the seals, update the increasingly archaic catalogue. I wore thick gloves, meticulously ensuring no direct contact with the crumbling leaves, my breath held, my eyes scanning only the spine, the index cards, the external markers of their dread purpose. I was a gatekeeper, not a scholar, or so I believed. I didn't realize then that the gate was not for keeping others out, but for keeping something in. The temptation, of course, was always there, a low hum beneath the surface of my meticulous routine. Each volume, wrapped in faded silk, secured with rusting clasps, or in the most egregious cases, bound with heavy chains directly to the shelves, seemed to pulse with a dark, forbidden energy. Their titles, sometimes visible, were an insidious litany of heresy and the occult. Liber Ivanis, Cults des Ghouls, the infamous Necronomicon in its original Greek and Latin translations. These were not just books, they were prisons, and I was their unwitting warden. I should have stopped when I first noticed the subtle shifts in the air, the way the shadows in the furthest corners seemed to deepen beyond the reach of my electric lantern, absorbing the light rather than merely reflecting its absence. But I kept reading, or rather, cataloguing. One night, a particular tome presented itself for inspection. It was a bulky, misshapen thing, bound in some dark, scaled leather that felt unnervingly warm to the touch, and secured with three massive iron chains that ran from its cover directly into the stone shelf. No title was visible on the spine, only a deeply carved symbol, an Ouroboros, but with a serpentine head devouring not its own tail, but a weeping eye. My instructions were to handle it with extreme care, to ensure the chains remained undisturbed. As I leaned closer, examining the rust-pitted links, a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears. A soft, metallic chink. I thought I was imagining it until it happened again. A more pronounced clink, followed by a faint, grating rattle, as if something heavy was shifting, struggling against its bonds. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden, frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. There was no one else down here, not at this hour. My colleagues, the few who were granted access to the outer archives, were long gone. A rodent, I reasoned, a draft, perhaps the ancient building settling. I tried to rationalize it away, dismissing the rising prickle on my nape. But the sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Clink, rattle, clink, rattle, coming from inside the book. This was the first mystery that tore at the fabric of my carefully constructed reality. Who or what was rattling those chains from the inside? And why did it feel like it was responding to my presence? That night I lingered, driven by an unholy cocktail of fear and a dangerous, nascent curiosity. The chains continued their spectral dance, a slow, tortured rhythm that seemed to emanate not from the physical links, but from the very heart of the bound volume. It was an impossible sound, a sound that defied physics, a sound that gnawed at the edges of my scientific training. I found myself reaching for my gloves, not to secure the book, but to touch it, to feel the vibrations with my own bare hand. A perverse urge, I know now, one planted by something ancient and insidious. But then it felt like an imperative, a path opening, beckoning. The scaled leather felt impossibly cold now, despite its earlier warmth, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to sink directly into my fingertips. Later, I would understand that the rules were not just about preservation, but containment. These weren't merely texts, they were conduits, anchors for things that longed to break free. My initial breach was subtle, a single, unguarded touch, a moment of unguarded curiosity. It was enough. The air around me grew heavy, stagnant, tasting of ozone and something akin to a forgotten scream. My lantern flickered, dimming momentarily, casting grotesque, dancing shadows that stretched and warped along the shelves, seeming to writhe with an unnatural life. I saw faces in the shadows then, gaunt and twisted, their mouths agape in silent agony. I blinked, and they were gone, replaced by the familiar contours of stacked, ancient books. But the impression lingered, cold and sharp. Just cataloguing, I whispered to myself, the words thin and reedy in the sudden, cavernous silence. My gaze fell upon a loose slip of parchment tucked into the foredge of the chained tome, a recent addition, not part of the original binding. It was written in a hand I recognized, Cardinal Valerius, crisp and precise, yet imbued with an urgency that belied its neatness. Non-ledger, ni in voces, do not read, do not invoke. A chill that had nothing to do with the archive's damp air ran down my spine. The warning was explicit, direct, unlike the generalized, never to read I'd received. This book, specifically, was an anathema. This particular volume was a living trap. My fingers, trembling slightly, pulled the slip free. It revealed not just a warning, but a single, carefully transcribed paragraph beneath, in the same cardinal's hand, almost as if he felt compelled to record the horror he was forbidding. It was a fragment from the book itself, detailing a ritual, a plea to something beyond the veil, to him who dwells in the outer dark. There were words, specific Latin phrases intertwined with what looked like ancient Aramaic that seemed to vibrate on the page. Verba tenebrosa, dark words. They were not merely descriptive, they were performative. As my eyes traced the lines, the very letters seemed to shift, to writhe with a faint, phosphorescent glow. A low hum began, not in the air, but inside my skull. I should have stopped there, should have turned away, should have dropped the parchment and fled. But the words, once seen, had begun to infect me, burrowing into my consciousness. They were like a splinter of ice, working their way into my mind, whispering promises of knowledge, of ultimate understanding. I found myself repeating a phrase, a sequence of syllables under my breath, my tongue heavy and clumsy. Ubi est vermis, ibi est porta, quia vocat solus perit. Where the worm is, there is the gate. He who invokes perishes alone. The hum intensified, becoming a throbbing pressure behind my eyes. The rattling chains ceased, replaced by a profound, guttural groan that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath my feet. My academic detachment, once my fortress, crumbled. This wasn't a scholarly pursuit anymore. This was a violation. I looked at my hands, shaking uncontrollably, and then back at the chained book, its leather cover now seeming to breathe with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The Ouroboros on its cover, the weeping eye, seemed to stare directly at me, its tear now a trickle of something dark and viscous, not painted, but freshly exuded. The groan deepened, resonating through my bones. I felt a cold breath on my neck, though no one was there, no door open, no draught possible. My mind reeled. I was no longer an observer. I was a participant, drawn into a ritual I had no understanding of, merely by the act of reading a warning that was itself a trap. The rules, I realized with a crushing wave of despair, were not just for the books, but for me. My throat felt constricted, my lungs burning for air that suddenly tasted metallic, like ash and old pennies. I wasn't just cataloguing, I was activating. Each syllable I had read, each forbidden symbol my eyes had lingered upon, was a key slowly turning in an unseen lock. The book, once inert, was now resonating with a terrifying, latent power, a power I had unknowingly stirred from its millennial slumber. The fear was no longer a chill. It was a physical weight, pressing me down, pinning me to the cold stone floor. I stare at my reflection in the dark, polished surface of the table now, and I see not just my own haunted eyes, but something else, something lurking just behind them, something that watches through me, waiting. I broke the silence of the catacombs first, not with a whisper, but with a rasp of forbidden vellum, the turning of pages that felt too warm beneath my gloved fingers. It wasn't a casual transgression. It was an act of profound hubris, a deliberate dive into a darkness the church had spent centuries burying. I should have stopped when the old cardinal, his face a map of ancient fears, handed me the key with a hand that trembled more from apprehension than age. But I kept reading, kept uncovering, driven by a scholastic curiosity that has since curdled into a perpetual dread, a cold sweat that never truly dries. I thought I was simply deciphering forgotten lore, but I was instead deciphering myself, unmaking the man I once was with every arcane symbol absorbed. The air down here, miles beneath the bustling chaos of Rome, is thick with the dust of ages and something else. A dry, potent scent of parchment and decay, yes, but also a latent energy, like static before a storm. My small, all-fed lanterns cast long, dancing shadows that stretch and shrink with every flicker, turning the cavernous scriptorium into a theatre of phantoms. I told myself it was the drafts, the ancient subterranean currents that wormed their way through these buried passages. But when the massive tomes, bound in what felt disturbingly like tanned human skin, seemed to shift on their heavy oak lecterns, their leather covers flexing as if breathing, I knew it wasn't just the air. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that something in this hidden library was alive, or at least sentient in a way I could not comprehend. The text I'd been obsessing over for weeks, the one the Vatican had tried to obliterate from existence, was a compendium of forgotten invocations and rituals, a whispered history of entities that predated human consciousness. The Codex Obscura, they called it, though not in any official ledger. Its pages were an impossible paradox of preservation, vibrant and supple despite their ancient origins. I spent my days hunched over its faded script, tracing the elegant, unsettling calligraphy, feeling the heat radiate from its heavy leaves. There was a section detailing the names that summon, not mere titles, but a series of elongated, guttural syllables that promised a direct, unmediated communion with the deep things of the earth. I scoffed, of course. A scholar's skepticism is a formidable shield. But late last night, as the last of the lantern oil dwindled, I found myself whispering one of those names, a sequence of sounds that felt both alien and strangely familiar on my tongue. That was only the first mistake. The second was not fleeing when the air grew heavy, like the pressure before an earthquake, and the single remaining lantern sputtered, plunging the chamber into near-total darkness. I didn't realize then that the act of utterance was a key, not just a casual experiment. A cold breath, impossibly deep, seemed to pass over me, rustling the stacked piles of ancient manuscripts on nearby tables. It wasn't the wind. This was a deliberate motion, a conscious exhalation that stirred the dust into ephemeral clouds and caused the individual pages of the codex to ripple, as if turned by unseen fingers. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum in the sudden, oppressive silence. Had I truly conjured something, or was my mind, frayed by weeks of isolation and arcane study, simply unraveling? The third mistake, perhaps the most critical, was the moment of quiet fascination that followed, the perverse curiosity that held me rooted to the spot, rather than sending me scrambling for the exit. I thought I was imagining it until I heard the distinct thud of a heavy book falling from a distant shelf, a sound that echoed through the vast space, followed by an unnerving silence. My breath caught in my throat. There was no one else down here, save for the occasional fleeting shadow of Brother Alaric, who brought my meager rations, his face perpetually grim. He never lingered. This sound, this deliberate disruption, felt like a response, a dark acknowledgement of my forbidden inquiry. The shadows around me seemed to deepen, to coalesce, becoming less like the absence of light and more like an active, breathing presence. Then came the voice. Not a loud pronouncement, not a thunderous declaration. It was worse. It was a sound that seemed to curl directly into my ear, bypassing my eardrums, settling directly into the deepest convolutions of my brain. Lo, a whisper woven from 1,000 dry leaves, from ancient stones grinding together, from the very static of the deep earth. The syllables were fluid, unsettlingly perfect, unlike anything human. And then, impossibly, unforgivably, it spoke my name. My full name, Julian Ethelred Vance, pronounced with an intonation that carried millennia of knowing, of waiting, of a patient, predatory hunger. My blood ran cold, then hot, then dissolved into a sickening jelly. How could it know me? How could this thing, this presence, know my name? Panic seized me, a primal, visceral terror that shredded through my academic composure. I scrambled backward, tripping over my own feet, overturning a stool, sending my last sputtering lantern crashing to the cold, damp floor. The oil flared briefly, a desperate gasp of light, then extinguished, plunging me into absolute, suffocating blackness. The voice did not cease. Now it seemed to surround me, a chorus of hushed utterances, not forming words I could fully comprehend, but pressing against my consciousness, probing, examining. It felt like being touched by 1,000 invisible, icy fingers, each one leaving a residue of ancient despair. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this accursed place, but the darkness was absolute, disorienting. I was lost, truly lost, not just in the catacombs, but within my own mind. I could feel them now, the books. Their presence was palpable, no longer just objects of study, but active participants in this waking nightmare. The leather bindings felt like cold skin against my outstretched hand as I groped blindly, desperately for an exit. The pages continued to rustle, a dry, mocking laughter in the impenetrable dark. The voice, now a singular, penetrating whisper, seemed to be directly behind me, its frigid breath ghosting across my neck. It wasn't asking for anything, not yet. It was simply there, an uninvited guest, made manifest by my own audacious folly, my desire to peel back the layers of reality. Veritas vos liberabit, the old saying goes. Truth will set you free. But what if the truth is a cage, forged from shadows and forbidden knowledge? What if the truth merely binds you tighter to an eternity of torment? The cardinal's warnings, once dismissed as the ramblings of a superstitious old man, echoed with chilling clarity. He had spoken of safeguards, of wards, of the thinness of the veil in these deep places. I had believed myself immune, protected by my intellect, my rational mind. But intellect is a fragile thing when confronted with the truly irrational, with something that defies all known laws of existence. The fear was a living thing inside me, writhing, coiling. It wasn't just fear of death, but of something far worse, the dissolution of self, the unmaking of my very soul. The voice whispered again, closer this time, and I could almost feel its lips against my ear, tasting the very air I exhaled. I didn't understand the words, but the intent was clear, unmistakable. It was taking root. It was claiming me. I should have stopped when the first page turned on its own. I should have turned back when the air grew cold, when the light failed. But I kept reading, kept searching, driven by a pride that now feels like a fatal flaw. This place, this subterranean vault, was not merely a repository of forgotten knowledge. It was a conduit, a gateway, and I, in my naive arrogance, had opened it. Now the knowledge had come for me. The whispers continue, even now, a constant hum at the periphery of my hearing, even when I am awake, even when the sun has long risen above the city of Rome. The dread is a constant companion, a suffocating blanket woven from my own irreversible actions. I am no longer alone down here. I am never alone. The pages still move, even when I am not looking, even when there is no breeze, no breath but my own. And it still knows my name. I still taste the dust of that archive, the metallic tang of old iron and parchment, a flavor that clung to my tongue the day I broke the ultimate law. It wasn't a physical breach, not a stolen artifact or a misplaced scroll. It was far worse. It was the moment I allowed my eyes to linger on something I was never meant to see, a forbidden entry in the great index itself. The Catalogus Scriptorum Interdictorum, as it is formally known, is not merely a list. It is a living chronicle, a testament to centuries of silent, unwavering guardianship. My predecessors, generations of silent men cloaked in the sanctity of their calling, meticulously inscribed each entry, each warning, each binding spell. It is immutable, a historical record, never to be edited, never to be augmented, save by the hand of the next keeper after decades of dedicated service. That day, the air in the deeper catacombs felt colder than usual, thick with the scent of aged leather and the faint, sweet decay of forgotten knowledge. I was performing the thrice-yearly inspection of the chained section, a ritual of duty that was more about presence than actual maintenance. These books are never touched, never opened, never even thoroughly dusted. They exist in their own cold, lightless purgatory, contained. My route took me past the pedestal where the index resided, its ancient vellum cover glowing faintly under the single gas lamp I carried. It was a compulsion, I tell myself now, a twitch of fate. My gaze fell upon the last page, the page reserved for the most recently added, the most potent, the most dangerous. And there it was, my name, Sealer's Thorn. The ink was startlingly fresh, a rich midnight black that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural wetness. Beside it, the familiar calligraphic script detailed the associated volume. Liber Tenebris Aetna, Volume VII, Shelf IV, Chain 13. The Book of Eternal Shadows. I knew this book. Every librarian knows of it, speaks of it in hushed tones, avoids its section of the shelf. It is a text of such profound malevolence that it stands apart, bound not just by iron chains, but by centuries of unbroken vigilance. I had never laid a finger upon it, never even brushed its spine with my duster. Yet here was my name, an indelible mark of ownership or, God help me, of destiny. I didn't realize then that the ink wasn't merely wet. It was alive, pulsing with a faint, unseen beat that resonated deep within my chest. How could my name be there, fresh upon a list that had stood immutable for so long, next to a book I was forbidden to even acknowledge? My first instinct, the one hammered into me during my novitiate, was to report it, to alert the prefect, to sound the alarms, to call for the cleansing rituals. But a colder, more insidious thought snaked into my mind, paralyzing me. Who would believe me? And if they did, what would be the consequence? Would they see me as a victim or as complicit? The index, sacred and inviolate, was now defiled by my very identity. It was as if the ancient parchment itself had reached out, a skeletal finger beckoning me into an abyss I had only ever skirted. I stared, my breath catching in my throat, until the letters seemed to writhe and coil, the black ink deepening, almost absorbing the lamplight. My reflection, distorted in the page's faint sheen, looked back at me, eyes wide with a terror I was only just beginning to comprehend. The silence of the chain section pressed in, a suffocating weight that carried 1,000 unseen whispers. I should have stopped then. I should have fled, sealed the chamber, never looked back. But the compulsion was absolute, a magnetic pull emanating from that newly inscribed name. My feet, heavy as lead, carried me towards Shelf IV, Chain 13. The Liber Tenebris Aetna rested there, a squat, black iron-bound tome, its metallic covers scored with symbols I couldn't quite decipher, not even with my years of theological and linguistic study. They looked less like script and more like scars, each incision a wound leaking unseen malice. The chains themselves were thick, corroded with age, but they pulsed with a latent energy, a tension that seemed to hum in the dry air. I could almost hear the low, guttural growl of its pages, a hungry anticipation. I told myself it was merely fear, the manifestation of my own guilt at daring to approach it, but the chilling certainty that it knew I was coming, expected me, was undeniable. My fingers, trembling, grazed the cold iron binding. A jolt, not of electricity, but of profound cold, shot up my arm, burrowing into my bones. It felt like touching something ancient and utterly alien, something that had been patiently waiting for my touch specifically. The chains, once rigid, seemed to loosen, not physically, but spiritually, their age-old grip weakening under my touch. This was not a coincidence. This was a deliberate act. I unlatched them, the rusted metal groaning in protest, a sound that echoed unnervingly in the vast emptiness of the archive. The silence that followed was even more profound, a heavy blanket under which something monstrous stirred. I thought I was imagining it until the slight tremor that ran through the stone floor beneath my feet, a low thrum that vibrated through my very marrow. The book fell open with a soft sigh, not to a random page, but to one specifically chosen. The vellum within was a sickly, jaundiced yellow, covered in a spidery, ancient hand that flowed like congealed blood. And there, staring back at me from the very top of the page, was my family crest, long disused and almost forgotten, rendered in astonishing detail. Below it, my full name, Silas Alaric Thorne, accompanied by a detailed genealogical tree stretching back for millennia, listing ancestors I had never even heard of. But it wasn't just a genealogical record. Interspersed within the lineage were strange notations, cryptic symbols, and dates. Dates that aligned with periods of unusual disappearances in the city, with outbreaks of inexplicable madness, with whispers of ritual sacrifice that the Vatican had always suppressed, attributed to pagan cults or isolated incidents of heresy. It outlined my very life, my birth, my childhood illnesses, even my unspoken doubts about my faith, details no one but I could possibly know. It felt less like a book and more like a mirror reflecting a distorted, horrifying truth of my existence. I kept reading, pulled deeper into its unholy gravity. The book wasn't merely a record of my past. It began to project my future. Vague, terrifying prophecies intertwined with the histories of others whose names had appeared in the index. Librarians who had vanished, scholars who had gone mad, prelates who had been disgraced and excommunicated, all of them connected by this same lineage, this same forbidden entry. The Liber Tenebris Aetna spoke of ancient compacts, of sacred obligations, of the very fabric of the Vatican's foundations being interwoven with dark, forgotten pacts made in the shadows of pre-Christian Rome. It wasn't heresy. It was the chilling, underlying truth, the unspoken cost of the Church's earthly power. The library, I suddenly understood, wasn't just a repository. It was a carefully constructed cage, or perhaps a sacrificial altar. I should have stopped when the names of the missing scribes began to appear, each one annotated with a chillingly brief Latin phrase describing their demise or transformation. But I kept reading, desperate to understand my place in this grotesque tapestry. Each word was a splinter under my skin, each sentence a tightening noose. The pages described rituals, elaborate and gruesome, involving specific bloodlines, specific astrological alignments, and specific texts that were, of course, housed here in the chain section. The culmination of these rituals, the book chillingly explained, was a grand conjunction, a summoning of the silent watcher. And a name, my name, was central to it all. I was not just listed in the index. I was indexed by the very forces the Church sought to contain. My life, my entire existence, had been merely a prologue to this inevitable, horrifying climax. The air grew heavy, thick and cloying, as if something vast and unseen had just materialized in the chamber, its breath stirring the ancient dust. I felt a cold tendril of something brush my neck, a phantom touch, and I spun around, my lamp casting wild, dancing shadows that seemed to coalesce and then dissipate, always just at the edge of my vision. The faces of the statues in the alcoves seemed to twist, their stone visages momentarily grimacing in silent, knowing horror. I slammed the book shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. But the words, the images, they were already seared into my mind, burning behind my eyelids. The knowledge was a toxin, already coursing through my veins, tainting every thought, every memory. I was no longer merely a librarian. I was a marked man, an unwilling participant in an ancient, unholy drama. The chains now felt like extensions of my own fate, binding me to the very entity within those iron covers. The library, once my sanctuary, had become my tomb. The silence of the archives was no longer peaceful. It was a watchful, predatory quiet, waiting for the final, terrifying act. My life has become a sentence, each breath a word in the narrative the book already wrote. I broke the sacred trust, the one implicit pact I had with the silent, forgotten volumes in this reliquary of dread. It started subtly, a barely perceptible tremor beneath the polished marble, but now it has become a full-blown seismic shift, rattling the very foundations of my sanity. I should have turned away when the first whisper of a thought insinuated itself, the idea that the guardians were not merely keepers, but feeders. But I kept digging, kept counting, kept charting the absences, and now the absence stares back, a gaping maw in the carefully constructed facade of order. The day Cardinal Bellwether came for his inspection, the air in the archives felt heavier, humid with an unseen presence. His Eminence, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, arrived swathed in scarlet, his retinue moving like shadows in the hallowed halls. He spoke of safeguarding doctrine, of preserving the Holy See's spiritual integrity against the insidious tendrils of heresy, and I listened, as always, with a practiced deference. Yet, even then, a flicker of unease ignited within me. His fingers, I noticed, twitched incessantly at his sides, a nervous tick that seemed to betray an inattention far greater than the mere formalities of an audit. What did he truly seek in our sequestered vault? This question, a faint echo then, now thunders in my mind. He strode directly to the Bibliotheca Obscura, the deepest, most restricted section of the archives, where texts too dangerous for human comprehension are kept under triple lock and ward. His eyes swept over the heavy, iron-bound volumes, lingering for a moment on the oldest, though said to predate even the very foundations of the Vatican, texts inscribed in dead languages, bound in skin not of any known animal. He made a show of surveying, his gaze flickering across the shelves, but his attention seemed unfocused, as if he were merely going through the motions, feigning interest for the benefit of his attendants or perhaps for mine. "All seems to be in order, Brother Thomas," he stated, his voice smooth, almost too smooth, a polished stone skipping across a quiet pond. "The sanctity of our knowledge remains inviolate, thanks to your diligent stewardship." He offered another of his wide, unsettling smiles, a rictus of teeth and stretched flesh that didn't touch the coldness in his eyes. He signed the inspection log with a flourish, his quill scratching loudly in the sudden silence. "Nothing has been disturbed, nothing taken." But I counted the shelves. I always count. A ritual born of decades spent amongst these silent, dangerous companions. Later, long after the cardinal's procession had receded into the Roman twilight, leaving behind only the lingering scent of incense and a profound stillness, I returned to the Bibliotheca. The quiet was different now, heavier, pregnant with an unspoken accusation. I walked the familiar aisles, my lamp casting long, dancing shadows, and then I saw it, a space about the size of a substantial folio, empty. The dust on the shelf was disturbed, a faint, almost imperceptible smudge where a heavy tome had once rested. My breath hitched. He had lied. The cardinal had lied about what was missing, and the revelation struck me with the force of a physical blow. My hands trembled as I traced the outline of the absent volume's former resting place. It was the Codex Ignominia, a text I had categorized as non-licit, a compendium of forgotten summoning rites, not for demons, but for something far older, far more primordial. Its pages were rumored to contain the true, unspeakable names of entities from the void, entities whose very utterance could unravel the fabric of reality. The codex was supposed to be inert, sealed, contained by its very presence within these sacred walls, its power dampened by prayers and ancient wards. But now it was gone. Panic began to coil in my stomach, a cold serpent unclenching its grip. I didn't realize then the true gravity of this theft, the profound shift it heralded in the very nature of our guardianship. I only knew that a barrier had been breached, a critical piece of the puzzle removed, and the carefully maintained balance of power between what we contained and what contained us had been irrevocably altered. A dread premonition, a cold memento mori for the soul, washed over me, a feeling that I was no longer merely a watchman, but a victim in waiting. That night I dreamt of him, Cardinal Bellwether, clad in his crimson robes, not in the archives, but in a vast, echoing chamber I couldn't place. He was surrounded by flickering candlelight, and in his hands was a book, the book. He was tearing out pages, not with his hands, but with his teeth, his jaw working with a savage, animalistic rhythm. Each ripped page was consumed, dissolving into darkness that bloomed from his mouth like ink in water. I awoke in a cold sweat, the scent of parchment and something metallic, like old blood, clinging to my nostrils. Were the priests truly guarding us from heresy, or were they feeding on it, nurturing it for their own inscrutable, terrifying ends? I began to review the logs, the entries from centuries past. My predecessors, diligent men, had often noted anomalous occurrences, fleeting shadows, strange whispers, but always attributed them to the oppressive nature of the forbidden texts themselves, the psychological toll of proximity to such dark knowledge. Now I saw a pattern, faint yet discernible, a slow, deliberate erosion of protective measures, punctuated by infrequent, highly placed inspections, always followed by a subtle shift, a new vulnerability. This wasn't negligence, it was design. This was the terrifying realization that perhaps the greatest heresies were not outside our walls, but within them, nurtured by those we trusted most. My research into the Codex Ignominia intensified, driven by a desperate need to understand what had been unleashed. The original catalogue entry, written in a cramped, archaic script, warned against even reading its title aloud without proper ritual purification. It spoke of verbum tenebris, words of shadow, and the terrifying capacity of language to give form to the formless. I cross-referenced it with other condemned works, the Liber Profanus, the Cantus Abyssalis, and found chilling commonalities, obscure symbols, patterns of numerology, and the horrifying implication that certain entities were not merely invoked, but summoned by the precise arrangement of their true names. I thought I was imagining it at first, the way the air would occasionally grow heavy and cold, even in the hermetically sealed environment of the vault, or the fleeting, peripheral glimpses of movement, like shadows detaching themselves from the corners of my vision. But then the books themselves began to react. I would find volumes slightly ajar, though I had meticulously closed them. Dust motes would swirl not randomly, but in deliberate, spiraling patterns. And sometimes, faintly, from the deeper, darker reaches of the archive, I would hear it, a low, resonant hum, a vibration that resonated not through the floor, but through the very bone of my skull. It felt like something was trying to speak, or, worse, listen. The paranoia consumed me. Every creak of the ancient building, every gust of wind whistling through the high windows, became a harbinger of something insidious. I started to check the locks on my own living quarters multiple times, convinced that the cardinal, or someone working for him, was now watching me, monitoring my reaction, my investigation. I barely slept, haunted by the image of Bellwether's tooth-torn pages, the chilling possibility that he wasn't just using the codex, but literally ingesting its power. This wasn't about guarding orthodoxy. It was about internalizing it, transforming into something altogether alien. I should have stopped when the first whispers began to solidify into actual thoughts, suggestions that weren't my own, fleeting ideas that darted through my mind like dark fish in murky water. Thoughts of opening other restricted volumes, of testing the wards, of pronouncing certain syllables just to see what would happen. But the stolen codex had left an open wound, a void that seemed to pull at my consciousness, demanding to be filled. I became obsessed with understanding the mechanism of its power, the reason for its theft, and the ultimate purpose of those who now wielded it. The very act of searching for the truth felt like a violation of the sacred boundaries I had sworn to uphold. My nights became a blur of frantic research, illuminated by the guttering flame of my oil lamp, surrounded by towering stacks of supporting texts, counter-heresies, and forgotten theological debates. Each answer I uncovered only spawned a dozen new questions, each more terrifying than the last. The true significance of the Codex Ignominia was not just its ability to summon, but its capacity to bind the summoner, to turn the act of invocation into a symbiotic, parasitic relationship. Those who used it were not masters, but vessels, and Cardinal Bellwether, with his wide, empty smile, was now a host. I felt a cold dread settle in my chest, realizing the enormity of the corruption. I am trapped now, utterly and completely. I know too much. The information I've meticulously gathered, The connections I've made between the Cardinal's deception and the chilling properties of the missing codex have branded me. This knowledge is not a shield. It is a mark, drawing the attention of whatever entity Bellwether has unleashed or become. The shadows in the vault are no longer merely shadows. They are nascent forms, indistinct, yet undeniably present. And the hum has intensified, a deep, pervasive thrum that vibrates through the very foundations of this ancient place, a sound that promises not absolution, but eternal damnation. My only regret is that I can no longer unsee what I have seen, unlearn what I have learned, and the silence of the archives now feels like the silence of a tomb, slowly sealing shut around me. I often wonder why I ever reach for it. Such a simple, almost unconscious gesture, brushing my fingertips against the spine of that nameless volume. It sat on a shelf in section XII, among texts rarely disturbed, those deemed praeter legem, beyond the law, even by our permissive standards here in the deeper archives. Most had faded titles, obscuring their forgotten horrors, but this one offered only a smear, a viscous, midnight black bleeding across the rough, grey leather. It looked like the ink had wept, then dried, leaving a raised, almost scab-like texture. My breath caught in my throat then, a strange premonition, but the lure of the unknown, the professional curiosity, proved too strong. I should have stopped when the initial chill traced its way up my arm, a feeling that had nothing to do with the library's damp, cool air. The moment my skin met that crude stain, a sensation unlike anything I had ever known jolted through me. It wasn't merely tactile, it felt porous, as if the ink wasn't just on the surface of the book, but within it, and now within me. I pulled my hand back sharply, a faint, dark smudge left on my index finger. Annoyed, I tried to rub it off, first with my thumb, then against the coarse fabric of my robes. It didn't smear, it didn't lighten. Instead, the faint mark seemed to deepen, the blackness intensifying, spreading subtly beneath the epidermal layer like a fine, branching root. I remember thinking it was just a particularly stubborn, old pigment, a curiosity of archaic manufacturing. I didn't realize then that I had invited something much, much older than ink into my flesh. This was only the first mistake, the first tiny fracture in the dam. The faint discoloration persisted throughout the day, a constant, irritating reminder. I scrubbed with soap and hot water, even a mild solvent from the conservation lab, but it clung, resolute. By evening, a peculiar tingling began, a subtle itch that migrated, not staying in one spot but moving across my finger, up my wrist. I found myself staring at it under the dim desk lamp, mesmerized. The veins beneath the skin around the mark seemed to darken, a faint, blue-black filigree extending further than it should. My thoughts began to scatter, too, fragments of half-remembered scripture intermingling with snippets of forbidden chants I'd only ever glimpsed in encrypted marginalia. And then the word. It wasn't spoken aloud, not audibly, but it echoed within the hollow chambers of my skull, a soft, insistent whisper, a single, guttural sound I couldn't place. Sleep offered no escape. Every time I closed my eyes, the word deepened, becoming clearer, sharper. It wasn't a human word, not of any tongue I knew. I am fluent in 27 ancient and modern languages, including several forgotten liturgical dialects and the coded Latin of arcane texts. But this sound resonated from a place beyond human lexicon. It vibrated with a primordial energy, a low hum that seemed to emanate not from my ears, but from the very bone of my skull. When I finally drifted into fitful sleep, I dreamt of abyssal caverns, of monstrous, inchoate forms stirring in darkness, and always the ink. It crawled in my dreams, not just on my finger, but beneath my skin, a network of black tributaries spreading from my hand, up my arm, towards my heart. I woke in a cold sweat, the word a furious drumbeat behind my eyes. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of my composure. I returned to section XII, to the source. The book was still there, deceptively mundane amidst its shadowed companions. But now I saw the stain differently. It wasn't merely a dried splotch. It was as if the ink had grown across the spine, its edges not distinct but blurred, organic, like a fungal bloom. I dared not touch it again. Instead, I carefully, with gloved hands, pulled out the volumes adjacent to it. Their titles, when deciphered, spoke of corpus obscurum, of animi vexiti, of rituals to discern the unspoken names of entities that lurked in the spaces between scripture. My breath hitched. Was this ink a reagent, a conduit? I felt a sudden, profound loneliness, an isolation brought on by the dawning realization of what I had stumbled into. I began to research, frantically, furtively. My usual meticulous cross-referencing became a desperate scramble. I searched for mentions of a living ink, of specific symbols or phrases associated with such a substance. The Vatican archives are a labyrinth of secrets, some harmless, some deadly. It became clear that the custodians, the silent, watchful figures who managed these forbidden collections, were aware of such things. I found veiled references in ancient papal decrees to unholy marks, to verbum non licet, the forbidden word, and the dire consequences of its invocation. One particularly cryptic passage described a series of librarians of the Black Hand, whose duties ended abruptly, their records sealed, their very existence expunged from the formal roster. A cold dread settled upon me. Had I joined their ranks, the word in my head intensified. The stain on my finger was no longer subtle. It had spread, a clear, dark line creeping towards my palm. My veins, particularly those on my left arm, pulsed with an unnerving, almost fluorescent blackness beneath the skin. My thoughts, once precise and orderly, were now a chaotic maelstrom. Every shadow in the library seemed to writhe, every whisper of air a conspiracy. I kept hearing the word, Karthner, a harsh, resonant sound, endlessly repeating. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, a growing entity within me, shaping my perceptions. I started seeing patterns in the dust motes, hearing voices in the silence. I thought I was imagining it until I saw it, briefly, in the polished surface of an ancient bronze lectern. A faint, dark reflection, not entirely my own. Later, I would understand that the ink was not merely a dye, but a living medium, a fragment of something ancient and malevolent, designed to bind itself to a host, a conduit for something else. It was a key, and the word Karthner was the lock or perhaps the password to open a gate that should forever remain shut. The very structure of the Vatican, built upon layers of history and secrets, suddenly felt like a cage, a vast prison designed not to keep things out, but to keep things in. And now I was an unwitting part of its dark machinery. The library, once my sanctuary, had become my tormentor, its silence echoing with my growing horror. I should have turned back, reported the book, but the compulsion to understand, to know the source of this insidious possession, was overwhelming. The blackness continued its slow, inexorable march. My left hand was now mottled, the lines of the ink mirroring the pattern of tiny, almost imperceptible script. It felt heavy, cold, yet prickling with an internal heat. I found myself drawn to other forbidden texts, no longer searching for answers, but for resonance. The ink on my skin throbbed whenever I neared certain shelves, certain condemned folios. It was gidding me, or rather, the entity within it was. It wasn't just a stain, it was an extension, a silent, invasive limb. My psychological breakdown was complete, yet strangely lucid. I was aware of my unraveling, capable of observing it with a chilling academic detachment, even as my sanity fractured. The rituals, the names, the shadowed figures in the ancient codices were no longer mere stories. They were blueprints. I started to recognize fragments of the language the word belonged to. It was not derived from any known Terran root, but from a deeper stratum, a primal roar that predated human reason, a language of pure essence and cosmic intent. Karthner. The word meant the unborn star, or the blind eye, depending on subtle inflection. A name that was not meant to be spoken, let alone thought, let alone become part of one's very being. Every breath became a struggle, every thought a fight against the invading consciousness. I was losing myself, dissolving into the ink, into the word. The boundaries of my own identity, once so clearly defined by my scholarly pursuits and my faith, were blurring, eroding. The ultimate horror wasn't the physical manifestation, the creeping blackness, or the relentless whisper. It was the realization that this wasn't a punishment, but a transformation. I was becoming a vessel, a conduit. The book, the ink, the word, they were all parts of an ancient, patient ritual, a mechanism to bridge realms, to summon something unspeakable. And I, in my naive curiosity, had initiated the final, irreversible step. The Vatican had guarded these secrets for centuries, sealing them away in silent libraries, but the secrets were alive, waiting for an unwitting hand, a curious mind. The librarians of the Black Hand, they hadn't been punished, they had been used. And now it was my turn. I can feel the ink pulsing, almost breathing now under my skin. It tightens, a slow, agonizing embrace, pulling me further into its abyssal depths. The word is not a whisper anymore, but a roaring chorus in my mind, a symphony of 1,000 voices, all chanting Karthner. Every mirror reflection confirms the horror. The blackness has spread to my neck, tracing towards my face. There is no stopping it. There is only the progression, the final, terrifying communion. I wonder if, in the end, there will be anything left of me at all, or just the ink. I broke the first rule, the cardinal rule of the archives, the one etched into the very silence of the sublevels, a decree understood even before it was ever spoken. Never invoke, never address, never, ever pray aloud. Down here in the suffocating quiet of the locked stacks, where the air itself feels ancient and heavy with unholy secrets, prayer isn't solace, it's an invitation, a beacon. I knew this, intellectually, viscerally, yet the pressure of what I was unearthing, the sheer weight of the Vatican's concealed truths, had begun to fray the very edges of my sanity. The codices I was tasked with cross-referencing, their pages brittle with the history of heresy and forbidden knowledge, whispered to me in the dark. They spoke of forgotten names, of rituals that contorted reality, of a shadow world that mirrored our own, but was twisted and wrong. My hands trembled as I turned another page, deciphering the spidery Latin that described things no human mind was meant to comprehend, and a cold dread, deeper than any I had ever known, began to calcify in my chest. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of ink and parchment, each word a tendril pulling me further down. The decision was born of desperation, a last, desperate grasp at something sacred, something pure, in a place utterly devoid of either. I remember the chill of the subterranean air, the faint, metallic tang of dust and decay that clung to everything. I had sealed myself within one of the deeper, rarely accessed stacks, Section Lambda, a place where the air grew so thin it was a struggle to breathe, and the scent of ozone often hinted at lingering, arcane discharges. My single electric lantern cast a weak, struggling glow across the tightly packed shelves, illuminating the backs of volumes bound in faded human skin and ancient, unidentifiable metals. Adversus profana mysteria, theologia obscura, liber maledictionis. These were my companions. I was charting the theological implications of certain pre-Christian Gnostic cults, their blasphemous interpretations of Scripture, and the names they whispered in their forbidden rites. Names that, even written, felt like tiny burrs catching in my mind, planting themselves there. I had been instructed, implicitly, that merely reading these texts could be perilous. I should have stopped when the sheer cumulative horror of the research began to twist my understanding of the world, when I started seeing patterns in the shadows. But I kept reading, driven by that academic compulsion, that insatiable thirst for knowledge, even as my soul recoiled. My colleagues, those who still ventured into these deeper tiers, would sometimes speak of strange, fleeting sensations, cold spots, the faint sound of weeping, or the feeling of being watched. We dismissed them as the toll of isolation, the tricks of a mind overtaxed. I thought I was stronger, more grounded. But after days, weeks, of breathing this poisoned air, poring over pages that seemed to vibrate with malevolent intent, I found myself clutching a small silver crucifix, a family heirloom, pressing it against my chest so hard it left an impression on my skin. My lips moved, unbidden, forming the ancient words of Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." I whispered, the words barely audible, a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. I didn't realize then that the sheer act of uttering those holy words, in this unholy place, was the first mistake. The immediate effect wasn't a sense of peace, but rather a profound, chilling violation. The air in section lambda didn't just grow cold, it froze. Not the crisp, biting cold of winter, but a dense, suffocating absolute zero that stole the warmth from my breath, that prickled my skin and made the hairs on my arms stand rigid. The single lantern flickered, the light dimming as if struggling against an invisible pressure. Then the candles I'd lit, my small concession to tradition, to a sense of ritual that still clung to me from my seminary days, began to twist. Their flames, instead of reaching upwards, inverted, drawing down into the wax, burning with an impossible, eerie blue light beneath the wicks, as if something was pulling their very essence into the earth. The wax itself began to bubble and smoke, not melting, but curdling into a dark, viscous ooze. My eyes widened, my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was no trick of the light, no hallucination. This was real. A sickening silence descended, deeper than any quiet I had ever experienced in the archives. It was the silence of a tomb, yet alive, expectant. My whisper, "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures," died on my lips. And then it answered. Not a voice, not a sound in the traditional sense, but an echo, a resonance that vibrated inside my skull, using my own voice, but subtly, terrifyingly altered. It took the scripture I had just spoken, twisting it, mocking it, rendering it profane. "He maketh you to lie down in green pastures," it hissed, the words reverberating with a cruel, mocking amusement that was undeniably me, yet utterly alien. "He leadeth you beside the still waters. He restoreth your soul." The intonation was wrong, full of a predatory hunger, dripping with a condescending pity that turned my blood to ice. My knees buckled beneath me, the crucifix falling from my numb fingers, clattering softly on the cold stone floor. I should have stopped when my knees gave out, when the realization slammed into me like a physical blow. I was not alone. What occupied the space around me was not a figment of exhaustion or paranoia. It was there. But a strange, horrific compulsion rooted me to the spot, forced the words from my trembling lips. It was as if my own terror was feeding it, energizing it, and it was demanding more. The texts I had been studying, the forbidden names, the diagrams of summoning circles and inverse hierarchies, they flashed through my mind, now making a grotesque kind of sense. The sheer blasphemy of praying aloud in these accursed stacks, the unwitting ritual I had performed, had called something forth. "He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake," I choked out, a desperate plea, a last attempt to anchor myself in faith. The inverted flames pulsed, the blue light growing brighter, casting grotesque, dancing shadows that stretched and warped the already claustrophobic shelves. And it laughed. The sound wasn't auditory, not truly, but a wave of pure, unadulterated amusement that crashed through my mind, shaking me to my core. It was a laughter devoid of joy, filled instead with contempt and a boundless, ancient malice. It took my own voice, twisted by 1,000 years of unseen horrors, and echoed my words back, elongating them, stretching them until they were unrecognizable. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." It turned my declaration of faith into a horrifying prophecy, a grim promise of what was to come. "For I am with thee, my rod and my staff, they comfort you." The possessive pronoun, delivered in my own voice, resonated with an unbearable intimacy, a sense of invasion that made my stomach churn. I clawed at my throat, desperate to sever the connection, to stop the words that were no longer my own, but its. The cold deepened, pressing in from all sides, a physical weight that threatened to crush my ribs. I could feel its gaze, countless unseen eyes boring into me, dissecting me, reveling in my terror. The air crackled with a malevolent energy, and the ink on the ancient codices seemed to writhe, the forbidden names vibrating with a new, dark power. This was not a spirit, not a ghost. This was something far older, far more terrible, something drawn from the very fabric of the void that these archives were meant to contain. It was the knowledge, the knowing itself, weaponized and aware. "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies," I whispered, barely a breath, tears streaming down my face, not of sorrow, but of pure, unadulterated fear. "Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over." The irony, the sheer cosmic joke, of seeking solace in a psalm that spoke of divine protection, only to find it twisted into an instrument of my own damnation, was not lost on me. It was no longer just repeating my words. It was elaborating, extrapolating, drawing from the vast repository of forbidden knowledge I had just been studying. It began to recite passages from the Theologia Obscura, from the Liber Maledictionis, weaving them seamlessly into the psalm, creating a horrific liturgy that praised not the Lord, but the nameless, the formless, the encroaching darkness. It spoke of the 7 broken seals, of the weeping children of God, of the false shepherds and the true wolves. It used terminology I had only just learned, combining it with my psalm, crafting a blasphemous sermon that felt impossibly ancient and sickeningly new, all in my own horrified voice. Every academic reference, every carefully documented heresy I had encountered in the codices became part of its twisted sermon. Anathema sit, it hissed, quoting one of the condemnations of early church councils, but turning it upon me. My mind screamed, a silent shriek of pure terror, but my lips kept moving, forced by an invisible pressure. I was a puppet, a vessel, my body no longer my own. The flickering lantern finally guttered and died, plunging section lambda into absolute darkness, save for the unholy blue glow of the inverted candle flames. In that blackness, I felt its presence solidify, coalesce, though I saw nothing. It was a feeling of immense, crushing weight, of countless eyes, of teeth that were not teeth, of a hunger that was not hunger, but something far more profound and devastating. My breath caught in my throat, a ragged gasp as the last words of the psalm, now utterly corrupted, ripped from my mouth. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. But the emphasis, the intonation, twisted it into a promise of eternal torment, of a house I would never escape, a Lord who was anything but merciful. And then it finally released me, but not before the last echo of its laughter, a dry, rasping sound, filled the silence that followed. The inverted flames extinguished themselves, plunging me into total blackness, a darkness colder and deeper than before. My body sagged, collapsing to the floor amidst scattered parchments and the lingering scent of ozone and something indescribably foul. The paralysis lifted, but my limbs felt heavy alien. I scrambled backwards, pressing myself against the metal shelves, my heart still a frantic drum against my ribs. The crucifix was long forgotten. The silence that now permeated section lambda was different. It was not empty, but full, full of a lingering presence, a malevolent awareness. I was alone, yes, but no longer unobserved. The act had been completed, the invitation accepted. What have I invited in? I still do not know its name, but I know it is here. It is with me. My throat still burns with its laughter, a phantom echo of my own voice, no longer entirely mine. I know I shouldn't touch the dust, but the urge to feel the centuries of stillness, of forgotten whispers, is too strong. It clings to my fingertips, a fine, almost imperceptible coating of forgotten prayers and unread condemnations. This dust is a shroud, a veil over the true nature of this place, this archive tucked away beneath the very foundations of the Vatican, deeper than any cardinal or common priest would ever know. I violate countless regulations by being here, by even thinking about what I've seen, but the forbidden act of uncovering is now an inescapable compulsion. It was beneath that dust, beneath the ancient, scarred wood of my assigned desk, the one they always give to the new, eager custodians, that I found the first warning. My fingers, numb from endless cataloguing of texts that shouldn't exist, brushed against a rough irregularity. Not a knot in the oak, but a deliberate gouge. I scraped away the layers of accumulated time, and there it was, a name, etched crudely, deeply, as if with a frantic, blunt instrument. And not just a name, but a date, illegible in parts, and then a smear, dark, reddish-brown, like dried varnish, but with the unmistakable scent of old iron, of fear. Blood. There were more, under the lip of the desk, along the inside of the support beams, almost invisible unless you were looking for them with the desperate intensity of someone already lost. Names, generations of them. Brother Thomas, 1642. Sister Agnes, 1789. Father Julian, 1891, each followed by fragmented Latin phrases, prayers half finished, or single, stark words like fuge, flee, and always, always that dark, sticky residue. They were warnings, I realize now, smeared into the grain, not just with blood, but in blood. But who were they warning? And why had no one ever heeded them? This was the first open loop, a chill that had nothing to do with the archive's perpetual dampness. The most unnerving part, the detail that truly broke the last vestiges of my academic composure, was that many of these warnings were scratched out halfway. A name would end mid-letter. A prayer would stop abruptly after the invocation, Miserere me Deus, as if the hand that carved it had been suddenly, violently pulled away. Some of the gouges ended in deep, frantic streaks, as if the penknife, or whatever sharp edge they'd used, had been dropped or torn from their grasp. I traced the last, unfinished arc of a letter, L, feeling the dread pool in my stomach. What could have stopped them? And why did they leave the evidence? And I saw it, buried beneath layers of subsequent, more desperate carvings, almost consumed by the older, deeper marks, was a name. Mine. Not my full name, but the unusual, archaic first name I carry, the one no one else shares. It was there, carved with the same frenzied urgency, the same dark smear, followed by a series of numbers that, while not a clear date, resonated with a chilling familiarity. It was etched long before I was born, predating my existence by at least 2 centuries. I didn't realize then that this wasn't a warning for me, but a prophecy of me, binding me to a fate I was only just beginning to grasp. My breath catches in my throat, a ragged, panicked sound in the oppressive silence. The air in these deep catacombs usually feels still, inert, but now it seems to vibrate with unseen eyes. Do they know I'm here? Have they always known? Or am I merely walking someone else's predetermined path, a puppet on strings pulled by an ancient, unseen hand? The thought lodges in my mind, a splinter of ice, and I cannot dislodge it. I should have stopped then, packed my meager belongings, declared my sanity compromised, and fled this place. But the forbidden allure of the truth, of understanding, was too potent. But I kept reading, kept digging. The books I was cataloguing began to take on a new, horrifying significance. The prohibited texts, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, wasn't just a list of theological disputes. It was a blacklist of power. Not just the power of heresy, but a more tangible, dangerous kind. I began to notice patterns in the older, unbound manuscripts, the ones kept in lead-lined boxes, away from the light, away from everything. Certain names, certain constellations of symbols, phrases that were more incantation than theological debate. They weren't just about God, they were about summoning. They spoke of the void-born, of entities that predated creation, beings whose names, if spoken, could tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. I thought I was imagining it until the whispers started. Faint at first, a rustling of forgotten pages in an empty room, a sigh carried on a draft that wasn't there. Then they grew clearer, a chorus of hushed voices, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in a language that felt older than human speech, a guttural clicking, a sibilant hiss. They spoke of the pact, of the gate, of the sacrifice. My skin prickled with cold, despite the clammy heat of my own rising fever. My hands trembled as I turned the brittle pages of De Profundis, an infamous volume supposedly destroyed centuries ago, its existence denied by the highest echelons of the Church. Yet here it was, in my hands, its binding still slightly warm. The book detailed rituals, shadowy ceremonies conducted in hidden vaults beneath Rome, beneath the Vatican itself. Rituals not of worship, but of maintenance of placation. The names etched into the desks weren't just warnings. They were, I now understand with a sickening certainty, the names of the sacrifices. The librarians before me, the custodians, had been groomed, led down the same path I was now treading, until their time came. Their blood was not just a warning. It was a grim, final offering, ensuring the seal held, ensuring the sleeper remained dormant, ensuring the world outside these walls continued to spin. The paranoia became a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest. Every creak of the ancient building, every shadow that danced in the periphery of my vision, became a harbinger of my inevitable fate. I saw faces in the patterns of damp on the walls, heard my name called from empty corridors. Sleep offered no escape, only vivid, visceral nightmares of ancient, formless things stirring beneath tons of earth and stone, their tendrils reaching, always reaching. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as exhaustion, as the psychological toll of this grim task. But the carved name, my name, under the desk, scoffed at such feeble attempts at self-deception. It stared up at me, a cold, hard truth. I would pace the archive aisles in the dead of night, the silence amplifying every frantic beat of my heart, seeking a way out, a loophole, another warning that might reveal a path to escape. But all I found were more variations of the same doomed message. The pattern was horrifyingly clear. New librarian, new set of forbidden texts, growing understanding, escalating paranoia, until finally the scratching out of a name, the smear of blood. It was a cycle, a horrifying opus repeated through centuries, each generation of librarians unknowingly providing the next sacrifice. I was just the current incumbent, meticulously cataloguing my own demise. My academic references, my once precise language, began to fray at the edges, dissolving into frantic, almost desperate prose in my personal journals. I no longer distinguished between the objective study of the texts and the subjective horror they inflicted upon my mind. They were one and the same. The Vatican was not just hiding these books, it was actively fostering the conditions that kept their power contained, and we, the unfortunate few, were the unwitting instruments. My predecessors hadn't just left warnings, they had tried to leave a legacy of defiance, a desperate plea for someone, anyone, to break the cycle. But the words were always cut short, their struggle silenced. My hands, once steady with the delicate restoration tools, now shake uncontrollably as I handle the texts. The ink on the pages seems to writhe, the ancient Latin curling into serpentine glyphs, whispering promises of release, or perhaps of oblivion. I feel a growing pressure behind my eyes, a constant dull ache, as if my very skull is expanding to contain the sheer volume of forbidden knowledge I've absorbed. The barrier between my mind and the encroaching reality of the void-born feels thinner each passing hour. I realize now that this is not merely an archive, it is a cage, and I am not its custodian, but its next intended tenant. The fear has transmuted into a cold, hard resolve. I trace my own name again, etched centuries ago, feeling the ghost of the knife against my skin. They knew I would be here. They knew I would find the warnings. And they knew with absolute certainty that I would keep reading. The question is no longer if I am trapped, but how deeply, and what, if anything, I can still do. The shadows lengthen, not just from the single flickering lamp, but from within me, from the crushing weight of what I know, what I have become. I hear the faintest scrape, a soft, deliberate sound, echoing from the very floorboards beneath my feet. The dust isn't just centuries of stillness, it's centuries of silenced screams. I never should have touched the Liber Tenebris. That much is clear now, a truth burned into the raw edges of my perception. My hand, even as it trembles now, still remembers the cold, dead weight of the black iron, the intricate, almost organic feel of the sigils hammered into its surface. A language not meant for human eyes. A language I, in my arrogant pursuit of hidden knowledge, had dared to decipher. My scholarly curiosity, once my greatest asset, had become a malignant tumor, spreading its tendrils into forbidden archives and forgotten doctrines, eventually leading me to this abomination, a text whispered about in hushed tones even within the Archivum Secretum of the Vatican itself. They called it a myth, a parable, a cautionary tale, but here it sat, heavy and real, pulsating with a silent, terrible power that I, in my hubris, believed I could control. I thought I was imagining the subtle shift in its weight, the almost imperceptible hum that vibrated through the table until the lock, a complex mechanism of interlocking serpentines that had defied every attempt at opening, simply clicked, with a sound like a single, brittle bone snapping in the dead of night. My fingers, before my conscious mind could issue a command, moved. They traced the metallic curves of the cover, then lifted it, the hinges groaning as if protesting against the unveiling of a profound blasphemy. The pages within were of an unnervingly pale parchment, stark white against the oppressive blackness of the cover, utterly blank. A wave of anticlimax washed over me, a brief, fleeting moment of sanity where I almost laughed at my own folly, convinced I had simply discovered an empty shell, an elaborate decoy. I should have stopped then, closed the cover, returned it to its lead-lined box, and buried it under a ton of concrete. But I kept looking, compelled by a strange, almost maternal urge to protect this void, this nothingness that felt so profoundly wrong. Then the first shadow began to form. Not a shadow cast by light, but a shadow within the page, coalescing from the very fibers of the parchment, like ink bleeding upwards from an invisible well. It was faint at first, a whisper of a line, then another, twisting, turning, forming into letters. My eyes, trained to decipher ancient scripts, struggled to process this evolving text. It wasn't a standard alphabet. It was fluid, shifting, its form less about static symbols and more about the impression of them, as if the words themselves were made of smoke, just on the verge of dissipating. And yet I could read it, an understanding bypassing my intellect and sinking directly into the marrow of my bones, a cold recognition that made my blood run like ice. This was not written by hand. It was manifesting. A shiver, not of cold, but of profound dread, ran down my spine, tightening its grip on my heart. I wanted to pull away, to scream, but my gaze was locked, transfixed by the impossible script that now began to deepen in color, turning from a faint wisp to a rich obsidian black. And then, from the corner of my vision, I saw it, the quill. It lay on the table beside the book, a mundane instrument I had used for my own notes, its tip stained with a leftover trace of India ink. But now it wasn't mundane. It began to slide, inch by agonizing inch, across the polished wood, drawn by an unseen force towards the open pages. My breath caught in my throat, a dry, rasping sound. I tried to move my hand to intercept it, to stop this insane charade, but my limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, bound by an invisible force, like a marionette whose strings had been seized by an unseen puppeteer. The quill lifted, hovered for a second above the page, then descended. It didn't dip into an inkwell, it simply wrote. The tip, still stained with dried ink, moved with a horrifying fluidity, leaving behind fresh, wet script that pulsed with the same shadowy energy as the words that had manifested on their own. And the words themselves, they were mine. Not in the sense that I had thought them, but in the sense that they belonged to me specifically. I always knew the truth about Father Michael, about the donations disappearing, about his late-night visits to the orphanage. The confession, unspoken and buried, now materialized before me, raw and exposed. That was only the first mistake. My mind reeled, trying to comprehend this grotesque violation. This wasn't an observation, a guess, or a vague accusation. This was the precise, specific memory of a secret I had guarded since childhood, a dark stain I believed no one else knew. My eyes darted around the solitary study, searching for a hidden camera, a trick, a cruel joke perpetrated by a colleague. But there was nothing. Only the silence of the room, punctuated by the faint scratch of the quill and the accelerating thud of my own heart against my ribs. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. Though no one stood behind me, no window was open. It was as if the air itself had become sentient, heavy with an ancient, predatory awareness. The quill continued its relentless task, each stroke a fresh stab into the core of my being. It wrote of the time I had cheated on my dissertation, the Latin plagiarism I had so cleverly disguised, the names of the obscure scholars I had pilfered from, the precise passages. Veritas vos liberabit, a cruel irony, given the foundation of your career. It even added commentary, a chilling, disembodied voice in my mind, mocking my own past hypocrisies. Then it detailed my relationship with Dr. Alastair Finch, the illicit affair, the whispered promises, the eventual betrayal. My hands began to shake violently, but the compulsion to keep them open, to observe, to participate in my own undoing, was absolute. I was a spectator to the vivisection of my own soul. Later I would understand that this was not just a book, but a kind of parasitic entity, an echo of a forgotten god or demon, woven into pages, feeding on confession, on secrets given willingly or unwillingly. The Vatican, in its infinite wisdom and fear, had bound it, not destroyed it, knowing some things are too potent to simply unmake. They had merely hidden it, hoping it would starve. But I had found it, or perhaps it had found me. The terror escalated, a cold, clinical dread giving way to pure, unadulterated panic as the quill began to write about the most recent, most heinous acts, things I had done only days, hours, moments ago. It listed the colleagues I had slandered, the rivals' research I had sabotaged, the dark, unspoken desires that festered in the deepest, most unsavory corners of my subconscious. It wasn't just my past. It was my present, unfolding before me, my mind laid bare. Each revelation was punctuated by a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, the air growing heavier, colder, the shadows in the corners deepening as if drawing sustenance from my unraveling. I could almost hear the whispers of ancient, forbidden rituals, the chanting of names that summon, names like Xylos, Vihal, Kythos, names I had only ever read about in apocryphal texts, now swirling at the periphery of my consciousness, threatening to burst forth. My psychological breakdown was complete, my carefully constructed world of logic and reason crumbling around me like desiccated parchment. I wasn't just reading a book. I was being written into it, becoming a part of its horrifying narrative. My identity was being extracted, catalogued, and consumed. The quill paused, hovering at the bottom of the last page it had filled. Then slowly, deliberately, it began to form a single, chilling question. The shadowy script pulsed with an unnerving, almost triumphant glow, radiating a cold energy that permeated my very bones. It was a question aimed directly at the core of my being, tearing away all pretenses, all defenses, leaving me utterly vulnerable and exposed. It wasn't a rhetorical question. It demanded an answer. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that whatever answer I gave would seal my fate, forever binding me to the liber tenebris, or releasing me into a reality far more terrifying than I could possibly imagine. The darkness in the room thickened, pressing in on me, waiting. "Do you want out?" And the silence that followed was louder than any scream. I should have stopped when the first entry refused to yield its end. I shouldn't have gone looking for the dead in a place that prides itself on preserving every fleeting thought, every sacred decree, every whisper of history. The Vatican archives bury its secrets deeper than any graveyard, but what I found, or rather, didn't find, was the true terror. It began, as all truly terrible things do, with a question posed in an academic's quiet study. Where are the librarians buried? A simple query, aimed at understanding the longevity of the custodians verborum, the keepers of the restricted sections, stretching back centuries. My assignment was ostensibly straightforward. Trace the lineages of these dedicated souls back to the 16th century to understand the evolution of their roles and the esoteric knowledge they safeguarded. A dry, meticulous pursuit, I told myself, poring over ancient registers of personnel, cross-referencing death certificates, meticulously plotted burial charts, and fragmented family histories, anything that marked a life's definitive end. Yet, as I delved deeper into the meticulously indexed, yet disturbingly incomplete records, a chilling pattern emerged, cold and absolute as a tombstone carved from logic. There were gaps, not just missing pages or faded ink, but entire individuals, names that appeared in active service logs, sometimes for decades, then simply ceased. No transfer, no retirement, no illness, no recorded death. Just absence. I didn't realize then that these lacunae weren't errors, they were evidence. They were the gaping maws of a truth I was never meant to uncover. At first, I dismissed it as bureaucratic oversight, a clerical anomaly spanning centuries within a vast, Byzantine institution. But the further back I traced, the more pronounced, the more deliberate, the disappearances became. Some names, after decades of dedicated service within these labyrinthine, dust-choked halls, just stopped, erased as if their very existence had been scrubbed from the annals of mortality. When I queried the senior archivists, their responses were practiced evasions, Smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, murmurs of privacy and sanctified anonymity for those who served the lex secreti. The records I sought, they informed me, were sealed for perpetuity by papal decree. A cold dread began to seep into my bones, a tendril of icy apprehension coiling around my heart. What secret was so profound, so utterly unspeakable, that its guardians had to vanish without a trace, their very deaths unacknowledged? It was in the supplementary ledgers, hidden amongst the mundane inventory of parchment and papyrus, that I found the first anomaly I couldn't ignore, a stark deviation from the meticulous order. A marginal note, almost obliterated by time and damp, scrawled next to the entry of a Father Alaric Thorne, a custodian verborum who disappeared in 1789. The note, in a trembling, antiquated hand, simply read, "Absorptus per librum noctis," absorbed by the Book of Night. A euphemism, a desperate metaphor whispered by a terrified contemporary, or something far, far more literal and horrifying. The innocuous scroll of faded ink became a burning accusation, a silent scream echoing across centuries, and I felt the walls of the archive begin to close in on me, not with stone, but with untold, suffocating secrets. I told myself it was fatigue, the stale air of the crypt-like rooms, the oppressive silence broken only by the rustle of brittle pages, the distant chimes of St. Peter. But the whispers began then. Faint at first, a sibilant hiss just at the edge of hearing, like a million unseen insects scuttling through the dust-laden air. Not audible words, more a sensation, a pressure on the inner ear, hinting at forbidden knowledge, at names that coiled and uncoiled in the abyssal darkness. My own name, sometimes, fragmented, beckoning. I didn't understand then the true nature of the communion these custodians had achieved, or the terrible price they had paid for their intimacy with the unspeakable. My research, guided by an increasingly frantic, almost manic compulsion, eventually led me to the Codex Obscura, a collection of texts so volatile, so profoundly dangerous, they were kept in a consecrated chamber behind triple-locked grates, accessible only with a bishop's personal dispensation and two armed guards, their faces grim and unyielding. I bribed, I pleaded. I invoked ancient scholarly privileges, fabricating a plausible, if desperate, rationale for access. And there it was, resting on a velvet cushion bathed in the pallid glow of a single electric lamp, defying the natural light of the sun. A single tome, bound in what felt disturbingly like human skin, secured with an iron clasp that pulsed with a faint, internal chill. Its surface, polished like obsidian, dark and utterly featureless, reflected my own face back at me with unnerving clarity. And that was when the real horror began to unfold, an insidious crack appearing in the ordered facade of my reality. I leaned closer, my breath misting the ancient, glass-like cover, my scholarly curiosity warring with a growing, profound unease. My reflection, pale and drawn in the dim, oppressive light, stared back at me, a mirror of my mounting fear. I shifted my weight, tilted my head, then froze. My reflection didn't move, not immediately. It lingered a fraction of a second behind, its eyes not following mine, not tracking my anxious gaze, but fixed instead on something beyond, a space only it could see, a dimension I could not perceive. And then, slowly, sickeningly, a smile stretched its lips. A smile too wide, too sharp, revealing teeth that were not my own, too pointed, too numerous, glinting with an impossible, predatory gleam. Its eyes, hollow and black as deep space, seemed to drink the light from the room and from my very soul. I should have run. I should have screamed. But the sound was trapped in my throat, a desiccated, useless thing. The reflection's smile widened, tearing at the edges of my mirrored face, a silent, ravenous hunger. Its gaze held mine, cold and knowing, as if it already possessed some intimate part of me, a tendril of my very being already ensnared within the abyssal depths of that forbidden text. The whispers intensified, coalescing into what sounded like 1,000 voices, a choir of the damned, murmuring my name, beckoning, urging me closer. Venite ad nos, venite ad veritatem, they seemed to chant, a siren song of ultimate knowledge and ultimate oblivion. Come to us, come to the truth. But I knew now that their truth was a dissolution, an absorption, a vanishing. It was a terrifying, beautiful erasure. This wasn't just a book. It was a doorway, a hungry maw, an archive not of knowledge, but of consciousness. The previous librarians hadn't merely disappeared. They had become part of these volumes, their intellects, their souls, woven into the very fabric of the texts they had guarded, their individual identities subsumed into a greater, monstrous entity of pure information. Their whispers weren't just the wind through ancient pages. They were the echoes of their trapped minds, a cacophony of accumulated knowledge and torment, striving to be heard, to be released, or perhaps to find a new vessel. And I, in my naive pursuit of academic truth, was standing right in front of the newest entry, a lamb for the slaughter. The Church, in its infinite wisdom and terrible pragmatism, didn't bury its librarians because they were too dangerous to be remembered. If you're still here, it didn't bury the darkness because they were never truly gone. But it listens. They were merely reassigned. Before you leave this story their living essence leave a mark into the very words they subscribe to protect, so you don't wander their minds adding another layer like to this the forbidden law. If you dare to hear more confessions, this wasn't like punishment. And tell me in the comments, a silent, what rule would you never break, sacrifice even in the dark, century after century, low, to maintain the sanctity? The next story is already waiting for you, too potent for human comprehension. A living, breathing archive of the damned, eternally guarding itself. Now I see my reflection in every polished surface, every darkened window, every cup of tea. It watches me patiently, its smile just a fraction too wide, its eyes a little too hollow. It is not always in sync. Sometimes it moves before I do, a preemptive twitch, a knowing nod. Sometimes it doesn't move at all, just stares, a silent promise of my coming erasure, a harbinger of the final transition. I can feel the pull, the slow, insidious drain of my own being, a subtle unraveling at the edges of my sanity, a gradual dilution of my essence. The books are not just in the archives. They are in my mind, their whispers a constant hum, a silent chorus of forgotten souls. I should have burned the maps, blinded myself to the indexes, deafened myself to the rumors. But I kept reading. I thought I was strong enough, clever enough to merely observe, to document, to walk away untainted. I was wrong. That was only the first mistake, the first step into a chasm that swallows light and life, one unsuspecting librarian at a time. The final transition, I know, will be swift, mercifully so, perhaps. I'm already becoming a whisper, a shadow in the glass. Every night the dream comes, or perhaps it's not a dream at all, but a premonition. I'm standing before the tome, and the reflection is no longer mine. It reaches out, its spectral fingers passing through the glass, through my chest, pulling inexorably. I am empty. The books fill me. Verba sunt lux, verba sunt tenebri, verba sunt anima. Words are light, words are darkness, words are soul. They are absorbing me slowly, deliberately, a page at a time. I write this now, not to warn, for who would believe me, but to mark my passage, a final, futile act of defiance before I too become an unwritten history, a spectral presence within the vast, silent libraries of the damned. My hands are growing translucent as I type, my vision blurring, and my voice, it sounds less like my own, more like an echo, an ancient rustle of parchment, already layered with other, older voices. The smile in the glass grows wider, and I realize, with a cold, piercing certainty, that I am already speaking through it. I knew the rules. Every initiate, every sworn keeper of the Vatican's forbidden knowledge is indoctrinated with them. Non licet penetrator, do not penetrate, do not seek what is not meant to be found. But the sheer weight of what was not spoken, the voids in the official histories, they pulled at me like a silent, gravitational force. I told myself it was scholarly rigor, a thirst for the complete truth, that drove me deeper into the forgotten annexes of the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the real archives, the ones that are never catalogued, never digitized, rarely even glimpsed. My superiors spoke of historical integrity, of preserving relics. I spoke of uncovering forgotten narratives. But my hunger was for something else entirely, something primal and illicit. That was my first transgression, the moment I chose curiosity over compliance. The air in those hidden passages is different, thicker, laced with the scent of aged parchment, ozone, and something else, something metallic like ancient blood. It clings to your clothes, to your skin, even to your soul. I should have stopped when the old Jesuit, Father Alaric, his eyes already clouded with a profound, terrifying weariness, warned me. Some truths, brother, are better left undisturbed. They are not merely truths, but doors. His voice, a dry rasp like leaves skittering across cobblestones, still echoes in the confines of my skull. But I kept reading, kept searching, convinced that the doors he spoke of were metaphorical, mere allegories for madness or excommunication. I thought I was stronger, more rational. Oh, how utterly foolish that thought was. I didn't realize then that the rules were not for the archive's protection, but for mine. My focus narrowed, drawn by an anomaly in the shelf coding, a sequence that made no sense, tucked away behind a false panel in a subsection dedicated to apocryphal saints and heretical cults of the early Renaissance. It was a single volume, unbound, encased in a shroud of what felt like dried, flacking skin, though the official records would have you believe it was merely vellum. There was no title, only a single, stylized sigil burned into the cover, pulsating faintly under the dim, electric light I carried. My fingers trembled as I touched it, a cold fire running through my veins, a jolt of recognition for something I had never seen before. A memory that wasn't mine stirred within me, a deep, ancestral dread awakening. The texture was unsettling, like touching the inside of a living thing. The pages, once released from their strange casing, were not paper or vellum, but something akin to dried muscle fiber, thin and brittle, yet resilient. The script itself was a nightmare of spiraling characters, some vaguely Latinate, others entirely alien, shifting subtly as my eyes passed over them. I remember the immediate disorientation, the slight nausea, the feeling of my mind trying to reconcile an impossible geometry. The archives around me seemed to hold their breath, a tangible silence pressing in, a sound cue, a faint, almost imperceptible rustling, like dry leaves skittering just beyond the edge of hearing. It was then, I believe, that the true process began, the impregnation of my being with something not of this world. The text spoke of the whispering chorus, of entities that dwelled in the interstitial spaces between creation and oblivion, accessible only through specific incantations, through a language of the soul. It detailed the convergence, a ritual not of sacrifice, but of absorption, where a chosen vessel becomes a living conduit for these entities, granting them a foothold in our reality. The names it listed were not meant for mortal tongues. Xylos, Kyra, Thulig, each a syllable that seemed to strip a layer of myelin from my nerves, leaving them exposed and raw. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a dull ache that spread through my skull, as if my very brain was being reshaped, rewired to accommodate the burgeoning knowledge. And still, despite the terror, I couldn't stop reading. The words were a narcotic, a venomous elixir poured directly into my consciousness. I began to see patterns in the shadows, to hear murmurs carried on currents of air that weren't there. The vast, silent labyrinth of the archives, once a sanctuary of knowledge, transformed into a sentient entity, its shelves groaning like bones under immense pressure. The books themselves seemed to watch me, their spines like sightless eyes. I started leaving the volume open on my desk in the restricted antechamber, unable to put it away, unable to close its vile, seductive pages. Sleep became a fleeting, fractured thing, haunted by visions of shifting glyphs and ancient, hungry faces pressing against the veil of my dreams. I would wake gasping, my body slick with cold sweat, the scent of parchment and ozone thick in my nostrils, convinced I heard the rustling of pages from the next room, even when the door was locked. My colleagues noticed, of course. My pallor, the dark circles beneath my eyes, the way my hands would shake when I poured my coffee. They attributed it to the demanding schedule, the immense workload. "Brother Ilara, you must rest," Father Ignatius would say, his voice kind, concerned. He didn't understand. How could he? He didn't know the depths I had plumbed, the forbidden waters I had drunken. He didn't know that the rest I sought was no longer mine to claim. My consciousness was not an individual entity anymore, but a fractured landscape, traversed by alien thoughts and impulses. I was becoming a palimpsest, my own identity slowly erased, overwritten. The first physical manifestations were subtle. A slight tremor in my left hand, then a faint shimmering in my peripheral vision, like heat haze off asphalt, even in the cool, still air of the scriptorium. I tried to dismiss it as fatigue, as stress, as early symptoms of an age-old disease that afflicts scholars. Madness. I thought I was imagining it until the day I saw my reflection in a polished brass lockbox. For a fleeting instant, my pupils were not round, but elongated vertical slits like a cat's. Then they snapped back, leaving me breathless, staring at the perfectly normal, terrified face of Brother Ilara. It was a trick of the light, I told myself, a symptom of sleep deprivation, a desperate lie. The hunger wasn't just for knowledge anymore. It was physical, a gnawing emptiness in my gut that no amount of sustenance could fill. I craved the dry, fibrous taste of ancient paper, the metallic tang of old ink. I would run my tongue along the spines of dusty volumes, tasting the centuries, the forgotten hands that had touched them. The urge was relentless, an animalistic craving that horrified me, yet I found myself indulging it in secret, peeling off minuscule fragments, tasting the bitter wisdom. The books, I realize now, were feeding on me too, absorbing my fear, my desperation, growing stronger with every fragment of my sanity I sacrificed. I was no longer an archivist, but a resource. The rules, they made perfect sense now. Do not resist. That was the final, chilling injunction, etched above the vault I had broken into, the vault that contained it, the Book of Whispers. It wasn't a choice, it was a surrender. My resistance was futile, a last, pathetic gasp from a drowning man. I feel them now, the scribes within me, their unseen quills scratching against my marrow, carving their script into my very bones. They are not merely writing words, but writing me. I am becoming a vessel, a living tome, a monument to forbidden law. My thoughts are no longer solely my own. They are accompanied by a chorus of hushed, alien voices, whispering the names of ancient places, of blasphemous rituals, of truths that would shatter the fragile sanity of mankind. I look at my hands now, scarred by years of handling brittle pages, and I see the veins beneath the skin pulsing with a strange, dark luminescence. The air around me shimmers perpetually, and the scent of ozone and ancient blood is now a part of me, emanating from my pores. The other brothers avoid me, their glances furtive, their greetings clipped. They sense the change, the corruption, though they cannot articulate it. They just know that Brother Ilara is no longer quite himself, that something terrible has taken root. My humanity is peeling away, like pages from a sun-baked book. I am becoming one with the knowledge, becoming the knowledge itself. And the book watches me from the desk, its sigil glowing faintly, awaiting its final inscription. The silence that once protected the rules is now my prison, a suffocating shroud woven from fear and complicity, and I cannot break it.